Hey guys, how's it going? Are you stuck with a blown engine in your car? Then today is your lucky day, because today I'm going to show you how to replace the engine in your car. Now, I had to be honest with you. If you have a blown engine, you're not that lucky. But don't you worry, because I'm going to show you all the steps you had to follow in order to remove your old engine and install the new engine. So after watching this video, you'll be able to replace your engine by yourself, saving you a lot of money. When I say a lot, I mean a lot. You'll be surprised to see just how little amount of tools you need for the entire job. And if you already have some experience working on cars like doing oil changes or brake jobs, chances are you already have the tools. Any specialty tools required for the job? I'll show you them as I go through the video. I'm gonna split the job into 6 steps. What we're gonna be doing is we're gonna be isolating the engine from anything that is attached to it, including all the wiring, the air intake, the fuel lines, exhaust manifold, coolant hoses, the power steering pump, and finally we have the AC compressor. Once we isolate the engine, then we had to loosen up the engine mounts and also the bolts that attach the engine to the transmission. Then we had to take out the old engine, install the new engine, bolt the new engine onto the engine mounts, and finally we had to connect all the hoses and the wiring back together. Here's a couple tips you need to know before you begin. Different cars have different engines, so be sure to gather as much information on your car's engine as you can. Also, if you want to get the job done faster, definitely consider using power tools because we had to deal with lots of nuts and bolts throughout the job. Alright, now that's enough talking. Let's begin. The first thing we had to do is to remove this bonnet. There's 2 bolts on the left side and 2 bolts on the right side. With all 4 bolts removed, now we can take off the bonnet. This will give us a lot more room to work with. Throughout the job, we're going to be removing lots of bolts, so every time you take one off, be sure to put it back in where it belongs so you wouldn't lose it or even mix it up with another one. I'm also going to take off the front bumper so that we can get more working room. Because we're going to be disconnecting all the wiring, it is a good idea to remove the battery now, so we wouldn't short out anything. Then we can take off the airbox and all the air hoses go into the intake manifold, so we can clearly see the engine, and also the hoses and the wiring we had to take off. But before you want to remove any of that, you want to do something very important, and that is taking a photo. Replacing an engine can be intimidating, especially if you're doing this for the first time. The biggest fear for most people is to remember where all the wiring goes back when it's time to reconnect them. So you want to take photos from different angles to cover all the wiring and the hoses, so you wouldn't mix them up. Plus, this will give you such a peace of mind if something goes wrong. Now we have to remove the radiator. So let's put a drain pan under the radiator and take off the drain plug. With all the coolant drained out of the radiator, now we can take off the coolant hoses goes to the engine. There's the 2 coolant hoses going in and out of the engine. You want to be careful when removing hoses like this, especially in a 15-year-old car like this, because with the time, rubber hoses tend to stick to the pipes really tight, so you want to be careful not to break anything. You can try some wiggling, some twisting, or even applying some heat to break the bond loose. Especially with these plastic fittings, which can be very brittle, being next to a hot engine for 15 years. I'm also going to take off these 2 hoses goes to the heater core, so we can take out the entire cooling system out. Life is nothing without challenges, and here comes the first one. This AC condenser is attached to the AC compressor. This line is flexible, but when we go to the other side, this is hard lines. So we have 2 choices. Either we can disconnect these lines, or we can leave the lines and unbolt the compressor from the bracket and leave it here. Now, if you're going to disconnect these lines, which is the easiest, then you can take out the condenser to get more room, but then you're going to be needing some AC gauges to fill up the system back with refrigerant. So I'm going to leave the lines and unbolt the compressor and leave it there. We just have to undo these 2 bolts and slip the belt off, and out she comes. While we are at the compressor, we can disconnect the exhaust manifold. Either you can remove it from the engine, or you can leave it on the engine and disconnect the exhaust pipe, which is the easiest. With the exhaust pipe sorted out, now we can move on to the wiring. We have to disconnect all the wiring that goes to the engine. I'm going to start from the top of the engine and work my way to the bottom of the engine. Now we have come to the fuel rail. I'm gonna take off the entire fuel rail because otherwise there's no working room to disconnect the injectors. You want to be careful when removing the fuel rail, as the fuel inside the rail is under pressure, so it can squirt into your eyes and you don't want that. I'm also going to remove the intake manifold as well, because this is going to give me much more room to get to the wiring on the starter motor and the alternator. With all the wiring disconnected from the engine, now we can take the wiring harness off to the side so we can clearly see the engine. Now the only thing hold the engine in place is two mounts. There's one right here, and there's another one down here, and also the bell housing bolts that hold the engine onto the transmission. But here comes the second challenge. Even if we free up the engine from the mounts, and also from the bell housing bolts, we still can't lift the engine because part of the clutch is still attached to the engine. If it is an automatic transmission, which is what this one is, we have the torque converter. Or if it is a manual transmission, we have the clutch pack. So we're gonna have to push the engine back in order to make enough clearance to lift up the engine. But in order to do that, we need to have some clearance from this side. But this is being a very small engine bay. Even after removing all the pulleys, we still don't have enough room. Even if I remove the transmission mount and slide the transmission off to the side, we still don't have enough clearance to lift up the engine. Now if this was a rear-wheel drive car, the engine would have been in a longitudinal direction, so we would have a lot more room to pull the engine out of the transmission. So in this situation, the best solution is to lift the engine and the transmission all together. So let's get to the transmission. To remove the transmission, we had to take off the drive shafts from the transmission. First we had to remove the axle nut using a breaker bar so that we can jack up the car and put it on jack stands. After removing the wheel, now we had to loosen up these two bolts that hold the knuckle assembly in place. Usually these bolts are really tight, so you may have to use a breaker bar if you don't have an impact wrench. Once you free up the knuckle assembly, then you want to use a hammer to get the axle all the way out. Now we have freed up one end of the drive shaft. In order to get the other one free, we had to go under the car. You also want to drain the transmission oil before you take off the drive shafts, unless you like surprises, if you know what I mean. With no oil inside the transmission, now you want to use a pry bar or a big screwdriver, and you want to stick it behind the drive shaft and pry it off until it comes out, and out it comes. You're gonna do this to the other side as well, but I'm not gonna show you that because it's gonna be the same procedure we just did. With both axles off the car, now we have to support the engine by jacking it up from the bottom so that we can safely take off the engine mounts. Let's start with the front mount. We had to take off these three bolts, and this mount is done. Let's move over to the other side and let's take this bolt out. Now with the front mount freed up and also the rear mount freed up, we have one last mount for the transmission. So let's undo that real quick. Alright, now the engine is free and ready to be taken out of the car. So we're gonna need an engine jack because engines are really heavy. You also need to have an engine lever like this. This allows you to tilt the engine at different angles so that you can get through tight situations. Now we have to attach the engine to the crane. I'm gonna use two steel chains at the front, one hooked onto the compressor bracket and one hooked onto the alternator bracket. I'm also going to use one tie down strap at the transmission to balance the weight. And now we are ready to lift up the engine. You want to look around as you lift to see if you have clearance around the engine. You want to clear out any brake lines or any power steering hoses that can get in the way because you don't want to damage any of them. Once you take out the engine, you want to lower it to the ground before you move it away. Because let's say the worst case scenario, the chain snap off, then by having the engine low to the ground, you won't make much damage to the engine. Now with the engine hanging by the crane and barely touching the ground, we have to remove all the bell housing bolts to separate the engine from the transmission. With all the bolts removed on the top, now we can move over to the side and take off the starter motor. Then you want to get a screwdriver to pry the transmission off and separate it from the engine. And out it comes. Now it is time to swap parts from the old engine onto the new engine. So let's start with the torque converter. First you want to get some white paint and put a mark on the dry plate. So when you reinstall the torque converter on the new engine, you know the exact orientation for the dry plate. This is very important because sometimes these are balanced with each other. So any alterations to the factory setup will make the engine vibrate too much and you don't want that. Now we have to remove the dry plate. So we have to remove these bolts. And out it comes. Now we are done with our old engine, so let's move on to the new engine. Because I bought this engine used from a private seller, the engine came up with everything, including the fuel rail and the air intake, So we only need to swap the alternator from the old engine. Also, this engine was in a car with a manual transmission, so we still have the clutch pack attached to the engine and we don't need that. So we had to take it off. And out it comes. Whoa, looks like we have a little oil leak. But this can easily be fixed with the engine oil stop leak, so I'm not worrying about this at all. While the engine is out, this is also a good time to change the timing belt. But the timing belt in this engine is still new, so we are good. Now it is time to reinstall the transmission onto the new engine. Let's start with the shield plate. We have to take off the shield plate because this one is for the manual transmission and here's the one from the automatic transmission. Now we need to have a torque range, because now we have to torque all the bolts down to the specs. But I'm not going to show you all that because that's going to be boring. Now we have to reinstall everything in the same mode as we took them out. Let's start with the drive plate, followed by the torque converter. You want to make sure you align the torque converter with the paint mark on the drive plate. And now we have the transmission ready to go to the engine. You want to slide the transmission into the engine and this might take some wiggling. Once you get the transmission to align with the engine, you want to start putting all the bolts back on. Once you're done, you want to snug up the bolts in a crisscross pattern and torque them down. Rest of the installation is pretty straightforward. You want to take off the alternator from the old engine and install on the new engine. Then you want to do the starter motor, and the engine is ready to go back into the car. Now, when I took out the engine, I removed the air intake, but now I have the air intake attached to the engine. So I have set up the chain to have the engine slightly tilted to the front. So when I lower the engine, I can get more clearance near the firewall. Now we are ready to lower the engine into the car. You want to place the engine right above where the engine actually going to sit in the car once lowered. As you lower the engine, you want to look around the engine to see if you have enough clearance from all sides. Slowly lower the engine onto the chassis. You may have to wiggle the engine to get the engine mounts onto the bolt holes. Now, I have already done this one. And also this one. And now we have to do the last one, which is this one. With the engine is now sitting on the mounts, now we have to plug all the wiring back in. Basically, we had to reinstall everything we took off to get the old engine out. I'm not going to show you all that because it's going to be the exact opposite of the removal and it's going to be boring. In conclusion, we had to reinstall the power steering pump, all the drive belts, the AC compressor, the exhaust pipe, radiator, and all the coolant hoses, the battery. At this point, it is a good idea to start the engine to see how the new engine works. Oh boy, did you hear that? I said that is job well done. With the engine is running perfect, now we have to install the drive shafts. You want to slide the drive shaft into the transmission and lightly tap on the end until it snaps in place. Once you get it in, then you have to slide the other end into the axle assembly and tighten the bolts. Then you want to put the axle nut on so we can put the tire on. Then you want to fill up the engine with fresh oil. It is a good idea to flush the engine at this time because we don't know any history for this engine. Once you're done with oil, then you want to add new coolant into the radiator. Again, you can go for a flush if you want. Finally, we can't forget about the transmission fluid. If you're not sure what fluid to go in, you can always have a look at the owner's manual. Last but not least, we had to install the bonnet and the front bumper, and we are done. We started off with the blown engine and we went from this to this. All we needed is some basic hand tools and an engine jack. You can always rent one of these engine jacks instead of buying because you're not gonna need an engine jack all the time in your garage. Alright, now that's how you properly replace an engine in your car. As always, if you like this video, press that like button, and we have cool videos coming up, so if you want to see more do-it-yourself videos like this, definitely consider subscribing to the Junkie DIY Guy channel so you will never miss another video. All the tools I have used in this video are in the description down below, so you can easily find them, and I'll see you in the next one.